diseases.
Well, you said that there's no proof that it is effective, that vaccinations work.
No, that's not what I said. It's not. It hasn't been proven that all vaccines are effective.
Well, I mean, I don't think that anybody's trying to say that all vaccines are effective.
No, I'm saying that it hasn't been proven. For example, it hasn't been proven that all vaccines are effective. So you really have to engage in a case-by-case analysis, and that would be an epidemiological process that would be placed before a state legislature, not a governor operating by divine right of kings, as it were. But you would put as it was in California. It was placed before the California legislature, and they basically reached the conclusion that vaccination is always good because some vaccines have eliminated some diseases. Well, that's not a brief for the notion that all vaccines are advisable. It just means there have been some medical success stories with vaccination.
Well,
I should add, maybe polio disappeared not because of vaccination, but because of improved birth weights and nutrition, neonatal and childhood nutrition after World War II. I mean, my dad and his generation, a lot of them were skinny GIs. My dad was eating apple butter and toast for 2 meals a day during the Depression as a 10-year-old. So when he went into World War II in 1943, into the Army during World War II, he was 130 pounds at age 19. I have his records, okay? So we forget the fact that when the vaccination age began, so did the outbreak in economic prosperity that increased things like nutritional food consumption for children and adolescents and everybody in society. So you could frame an argument that some of these epidemic diseases have disappeared because society has become more prosperous and more efficient at providing life support for the average person. Again, is it correlation or is it causation? The epidemiologists who support vaccination would say it's causation. We've wiped out polio. But those who oppose the logic of vaccination as medically unproved would say, no, we eliminated child hunger, or almost did, and therefore people have been more physically fit to fight viral infection. So it's a complicated issue. All I'm saying is I would only allow the state to mandate what parents do when the parent's decision is literally and is known without question to be ill-advised and the foolish, life-threatening thing to do or to allow.
All I'll ask beyond that, and like don't believe that I'm like as you say, it's a complicated issue, but I have to wrap up, and I will say, or just ask, at what point do you accept medical opinion on this issue? Like 80% of scientists responding say this, 50, 60.
Well, they've been wrong about a lot of other things. I don't believe right now, my bottom line position is I believe that there's a legitimate argument as to whether or not vaccines are effective. I don't know, but it's my sense as an intelligent, educated human being that the notion that vaccinations are effective may have been sold to us and not be true, and still be something that 80% of doctors or epidemiologists, virologists, or whatever would endorse as the truth. I know from my own experiences defending some very controversial truths that most people are not scientific, and the proverbial way of expressing this, I like to say, most people frame their findings based on their beliefs, not their beliefs based on their findings. Okay, so most people who believe that vaccinations work are deductively reasoning based on, I was told vaccines are effective, therefore I will get vaccinated because they are effective. They're not saying, well, let's take a look at vaccinations and see what else could have caused the elimination of these diseases, for example. and they don't analyze the efficacy of vaccinations in arriving at their position that's pro-vaccination for themselves or pro-mandatory vaccination for society. And I've debated my time travel claims, which are true claims. I mean, the United States government has had trillions of dollars to spend on time travel and many other exotic technologies in the past 70 years. It's had the brightest physicists and the most talented electrical engineers in the country to work with. It's had virtually the entire state of New Mexico to use as a laboratory, okay, with very little social or public or governmental scrutiny, okay. I know, debating my time travel experiences on Facebook, for example, where my time travel group has over 15,000 members, which I've done since 2009. That's been 7 years of argumentation. I've probably defended my experiences at least, 500 times now, okay? Maybe, at least 100 or several hundred times, okay? I know that most people are not scientific. They basically possess a belief, therefore that belief colors their findings. They don't look at the findings and then derive their beliefs inductively. So because of this propensity in society to be deductive in our thinking, to reason from a precept into our scrutiny of the facts, of reality, I am very suspicious that those who are now saying, I very much suspect that those who are now saying that vaccines are not effective may very well be right, notwithstanding the fact that they make up only, let's say, 20% of the adult population.
And that suspicion carries over into your sincerely held beliefs about personal liberty.
About liberty, not about epidemiology. I have gotten the RPT shot. I was going to go to India when I was a student at Cambridge in 1994-95, and I got a range of shots, I think, from malaria, cholera, typhus, tetanus. Okay, so I am a vaccinator personally, but as a public servant, I don't want to force what I think is medically appropriate for me on somebody who is medically opposed to that medical procedure, because my life and health and the life and health of other vaccinating people does not depend on that non-vaccinator getting vaccinated. I think the only public health issue here is, are we reaching everybody with the message to get vaccinated? Because we don't want to cheat somebody who would theoretically choose vaccination to not get vaccinated in the same way that those who avowedly don't want to get vaccinated decline to be vaccinated. At the same time, I don't think there's any medical reason that's been proven to me, no kind of critical mass contagion effect like argument, that if everybody doesn't get vaccinated, the non-vaccinated will infect the vaccinated. That's never been argued. It's always been argued that by getting vaccinated, you're immune from getting that disease spread to you. Okay, well, if that's the case, then I don't think there's a medical argument to invade the liberty interests of those who don't want that medical procedure. In other words, my argument is my position on this, Brett, is it's nuanced and it's complex. It's not based on some kind of new age or far right-wing belief that vaccination is a plot and that it's known that they don't work, etc. It's just based on a weighing of the medical equities involved against the legal and philosophical equities involved.
I understand. Yeah, I do. I understand. So I'm sorry I gotta cut this off. I have to be somewhere else in 20 minutes. But can you talk tomorrow, Sunday?
Yeah. Where are you? Are you in LA by any chance, or New York, or where are you?
I'm in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I read that on your Facebook. My mom, I thought you might have been out in LA with somebody, but my mom grew up in Brooklyn.
Oh yeah.
I used to go into Brooklyn as a kid growing up in New Jersey to visit my grandparents. They lived in a brownstone on Flatbush Avenue.
Ah, yeah. I know Flatbush
Avenue. My mom went to PS9 in Brooklyn, and 40 years after she left elementary school, we saw that 60 Minutes investigation of PS9 where the principal spilled the knives and shivs that the kids had brought to school on his desktop. And that was literally her elementary school. But I'm really familiar with Brooklyn growing up.
You're in North Carolina, right?
Yeah, I live in in Washington State, but I'm temporarily here in North Carolina because my campaign headquarters are here.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just temporarily here. Yeah.
Well, I'm from South Carolina.
So you're in Eastern. You're in Eastern time. What about 1 o'clock tomorrow? Would that work for you?
Yeah, 1 o'clock's great.
Cool.
So,
I'd love discussing as long as you want to do a good piece. Because I have, I am a deep thinker, and I do want my ideas, disseminated via this presidential campaign. And I was originally in it, believing I could win or maybe get the Democratic nomination. But the bottom line for me for running for president has just been the tremendous cost. If you're not a mainstream candidate with huge financial reserves, it's almost impossible to become president. And that's something I think we should take a hard look at. And I'd be happy to talk about that tomorrow. I think we should have kind of an internet-driven introduction of the candidate.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, there would be like a League of Women Voters type structuring of the candidacy so that they're more fair.
I'm happy to talk about anything that is not Donald Trump's hands or like whether Ted Cruz's wife isn't as attractive as his. I don't know. I'm happy to talk about it. But yeah, so I'll give you a call.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
I'll give you a call at 1 tomorrow.
Sounds great, man. Have a good night.
Hey, you too. Thanks, Andy.
Okay, take care, Red. You got it.
Yeah. All right, we're rolling. So, where did we leave off? We left off, we were on vaccination last.
Right.
Let's do something. One thing that I've found interesting is, I guess it's not a new idea to do stuff like economic boycotts, but you want to be specific in hitting various, moral practices. Like you use the example of Japan's killing of dolphins. You would like to see an economic boycott in order to change that. Like, what are some other examples of what you would like to target with boycotts?
Well, I'd like to ban the death penalty in the United States for a host of reasons. I mean, a myriad of reasons that are pretty complex to narrate right now. But if we did, I think we should hit China on the grounds that it uses the death penalty and it uses it gratuitously, it uses it excessively. And they even have execution vans in China. And I think that's extremely inhumane. So that's one that comes to mind. I think the overarching purpose of that proposal is that, corporations are sort of the fourth branch of government. They're sort of an area of unregulated power, which is kind of the argument that's made in books like David Corton's When Corporations Ruled the World, which I know Ralph Nader praised, and I agree. And the thing about boycotts and why they should be used more is that the moral universe should take precedence over the economic universe. And that's obviously that's what's behind my call to end slavery. There are 27 million slaves in the world, or at least quasi-slaves, and some are slaves per se. So we're not doing that. We're elevating the significance of the global economy above morality. And when human societies have done that, like in the slaveocracy in the American South, disaster follows and mass abrogation of the rights of human beings follows. So I just think we should be more willing in specific cases. Another example would be Saudi oil. I mean, look at the public executions of women who have been denied due process. Now, unlike China, most of those decapitations by the Saudi regime are for first-degree murder, but some are not. And that would be another example. I think we should be willing to lead the world morally and use economic boycotts to discipline the behavior of nation states, and be willing to accept boycotts against us when we stray. We're just not doing that. And it's a travesty because it suggests that the interests of the global economy take precedence over human rights, and I don't believe that's the case. I admire President Carter. People are very critical of President Carter as if his presidency was a failure, but on keeping us out of war and on human rights, his presidency was a great success. He was trying to utilize government to perfect the moral order, and that's what I think we should be about as a country.
So you bring up the corporations as this sort of fourth government, and lately it's been interesting to see that work in a good way, maybe the way that like various corporations have stepped up to pressure North Carolina on their LGBT laws.
That's an example. I mean, the anti-LGBT statute in North Carolina was based on bigotry and on discrimination. And there's an example. New York State, Governor Cuomo in New York State stopped, letting contracts to North Carolina. Bruce Springsteen refused to perform here. Mm-hmm. It's a perfect example. Why not do that? And the other thing is, kind of on a game theory basis, there's kind of a you get a race to the top, because if all nations are willing to impose economic boycotts for moral reasons, and some of the most powerful nation states with the biggest markets, like the United States of America, do so, then unlike labor and environmental standards, falling to the bottom, racing to the bottom, like under NAFTA, with economic boycotts, you get a race to the top. You have all nation states capable of closing their market to the economic entities or consumers of another country because of their behavior. And that's a powerful instrument to bring about the moral perfection of society.
But so on that same note, another thing you want to do is democratize transnational corporations. And yeah, I mean, I guess just tell us what that, what you mean.
Well, I actually just should put corporations. I didn't. I mean, it's not really essential that they be transnational. They could just be operating within the United States. I just meant that we should, because corporate leadership, corporate governance represents a non-constitutionally delegated form of power. So, for example, a corporate employer can tell you who you're romantically involved with. A corporation can tell you what the goods that are going to be reasonably available in your community are going to be, like if a Walmart comes in. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I simply mean that because this form of non-delegated, basically unconstitutional power exists, we should find creative ways to democratize the corporations and their impacts on their employees first, and then the community. So, for example, requiring employee stock ownership plans rather than just allowing them for corporations over a certain size is an example of that. You're saying, if this corporation gets so big and has such an employee base that it should begin to become a quasi-public institution in limited ways. I'm not against the profit motive. Mm-hmm. And I do believe the business of America is business. I'm pro-corporate in the sense, like Obama was when we had the argument in 1983, in the sense that corporate organization is a necessary form of social organization to limit liability and to allow large economic activities to be undertaken effectively. I just mean that because they're so pervasive in how they affect our lives, that we should ask for ways of how to democratize them. So, for example, the media conglomerates that rule television, I would require a portion of mainstream commercial programming to be determined by the consumer, by the viewer, rather than having everything pushed at the viewing public. the ESOP, requiring ESOPs for corporations over a certain number of employees and a certain size. That's another example. I'm sure there are many others that we can think of, but that's basically the spirit of that. I don't mean that we should impose socialism on the corporations, because socialism, quite frankly, does not work because there's no money in it. I'm a Cambridge economist, and I'm not a socialist of the Bernie Sanders ilk, or even farther left of that. I'm not a Swedish socialist, a British socialist. I'm a democratic capitalist. My concern is that there were four political economies that were at war for supremacy during the 20th century. Basically, the two that espoused authoritarian government, fascism and communism, and the two that did not, socialism and democratic capitalism. And then you can distinguish fascism from communism in the sense that fascism espouses the private collectivization of property, while communism espouses public property. And then among the non-authoritarian political economies, socialism espouses public ownership of property, and democratic capitalism espouses private ownership of property. I believe in the traditional American political economy, which sought to combine non-authoritarian government, or government by the consent of the governed, with the private ownership of property. I believe that's the superior model of political organization. That's what we embodied as a country. But the problem is that because we retained the private ownership of property and allowed basically a widely disparate set of economic outcomes among citizens, economic players, however you want to define them, as we began to move towards authoritarian government embodied in things like the Patriot Act, we began to move from democratic capitalism towards fascism. That should alarm all of us. So because that's been going on, if we begin to focus on democratizing the corporations, then we pull the United States back from becoming a fascist society. A fascist society would be characterized by authoritarian, non-consensual government. And I don't think anybody can argue that aspects of a police state are forming in the United States. So it combines, fascism combines authoritarian government with private ownership of property. So if we don't democratize the corporations, we're inevitably going to transition from democratic capitalism towards fascism. I don't think trying to find ways to democratize the corporations are, Gary Hart, new idea kind of idealism. I don't think somebody's an Atari Democrat if they espouse, if they recognize that the corporations do embody a form of government that's not regulated and that we're not attempting to democratize, that we are moving towards authoritarian government. So I think the attempt to democratize the corporations is the effective way by which we pull back our destiny as a country and begin to again espouse democratic capitalism. So I don't believe in a confiscatory income tax. I just believe that on the margin we should try to democratize the corporations as much as possible.
So, to go back to your example about television, how would you theoretically see, content chosen by the people?
Well, I would transition them to falling somewhere between commercial and public television. I would recognize, since they have their capital at risk when they decide, to put a sports game on rather than a concert, that they're the economic stakeholder for those investments in what's on the air. But that a portion of their programming should be determined by, let's say, a citizens committee of maybe learned musicians and artists and professors and so forth. Because look, if television is prevalent, if it's the prevalent form of mainstream media, I guess YouTube is starting to overtake commercial television, but still, commercial television is watched by hundreds of millions of Americans, so fairly regularly. So I would just have a kind of a public television-driven citizens committee so that a certain amount of programming would be allocated towards higher culture, like maybe 10% of their program. So everything's not, silly cartoons, crass, soap operas and comedies, and sports games. And that's what we're getting.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I'm concerned that American school children are, even into their adolescence, are watching a heck of a lot of sort of higher end cartoons. You know, as the kids are aging, they're no longer watching Scooby Doo, but they're watching, I forgot the name of it. Let me think of this example. Gravity Falls, and those kind of, wacky higher end cartoons that the parents can also watch and laugh at the double entendres and the esoteric jokes that they're now embedding into those cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's fine for popular culture to evolve like that. But are the kids watching movie classics? Are they watching 12 Angry Men, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Caine Mutiny, and classic feature films with moral content, Saving Private Ryan? I don't think they are. I think our common culture is being debased by inferior cultural content, and one of the main delivery mechanisms of that inferior culture is television. So I would have a citizens committee of learned, talented people who would select that 10% of the programming.
Mm-hmm. So
it might be a Johnny Mathis concert. It might be a classic film. In other words, you'd have, because the one thing I know about media, having lived in LA and having known people in media from different art forms, like we had a neighbor who had done everything in music, from play saxophone in Kay Kaiser's big band to record produce Barbra Streisand. He did everything in music, Warren Vincent. And what I learned from Warren is that the claim that media conglomerates give the people what they want based on popularity is not true. They actually determine the market. In other words, they determine what they're going to market, and then they sell it. It's not a meritocratic or a plebeian system where record sales govern the records that are produced. The record producers govern the records that are produced based on trending to some extent, but also just on production selection of particular bands and instrumentalists and singers and so forth, and then they market. So we haven't recognized this as a society, that media selection is not governed by populist forces. It's governed by corporate forces. The corporations are determining what to market to us. So, if they learn that, Colby Calais got 37 million downloads of her song Bubbly on MySpace, yeah, she's going to get a recording contract. But, so is another group if they think that group is making music in a trendy area of music. It's not the buyership of the people that determines who's produced, let's say, in the record industry. It's the calculations that are made by the A&R people for the record companies. Mm. And it's a spurious concept that we live in, a plebeian democracy where the consumers of mainstream media content determine it. They don't.
Yeah.
The production companies do, and therefore, if we don't include community input, everything gets debased by investment decisions rather than cultural decisions. And I don't think that's in our interest as a society. So,
yeah, I mean, that's
and
good.
Nobody ever says it because as long as they continue to give people a couple things that they become fans of, like, I don't know, The Simpsons or something, the population never really gets this. The American people have never really gotten this, and they remain sort of placated. Mm-hmm. And they think they're being given what they're buying, but actually they're buying what they're being given. That's my position.
So on a related topic, of just like mediums, the platforms, like you want a court to be established that would only deal with cases involving the internet. So how would this court system work differently than the one we have?
It would just be a specialized court, just like the bankruptcy courts and tax courts and admiralty courts and so forth. It would, it would say the internet is becoming literally the domain of global civilization. It's becoming the agora, the meeting place of society on many, many levels. So it would say that the things that go on the internet are so ubiquitous and so dominant that it's difficult for a person who's active on the internet to really even police the internet. So, for example, I'm very active on the internet. I utilize it in my law practice. I use it to communicate personally. I founded and maintain a number of groups, actively maintain a number of groups on Facebook. I'm going to clean up Twitter and get my own actual name on Twitter and start tweeting in my campaign and so forth. And what I found being online is it's difficult for the individual to interact with the internet or be featured on the internet and really preserve his or her legal rights. I mean, because it's so there's so much content that virtually everybody during their career on the internet is subject to defamation of character, copyright infringement, false light publicity, stalking, and so forth. So I would just, in the interest of judicial economy, I would simply say, let's found an internet court that only deals with internet matters. And as a federal court system, those magistrates could also specialize on issuing the warrants for government searches of people online, because that's another area where you could potentially have your rights infringed if, let's say, your email traffic is being eavesdropped by the National Security Agency. I don't think that any of our alphabet intelligence agencies or criminal, prosecutorial, or regulatory agencies should necessarily be denied the capacity to surveil somebody online if they are enforcing the criminal code or the administrative code. I just think that we should comport with the Bill of Rights under the Fourth Amendment and make those warranted searches. In other words, a lawful magistrate should issue a warrant to permit the infringement of that person's privacy. Okay, so I would do everything from have that court do that, issue the warrants to do surreptitious searches of people's internet traffic, but also protect the rights of individual Americans and consumers by, it would be the place where you would file a standard form for defamation, and the court would shut down the defamatory content. In other words, see, the problem is the internet emerged as a Defense Department communications network, and then it emerged in a highly privatized commercial context, and essentially it's the Wild Wild West. It's a place where regularly people get defamed. For example, I'm a public figure, but I'm also an attorney at law privately and a human being. And right now, an individual named Tory Smith is falsely alleging in a YouTube that I have raped and killed 111 children. I mean, that's so ridiculous. It's asinine, yes, and most people won't believe it. But some people will, and I will be actively defamed. I'll even be defamed subtly, even among the people who don't believe that wild, impossible claim, because it just leaves the odor of a crime involving moral turpitude. Now, I've lived a Christic life. I've lived a good life where I've done right by other people. I was raised that way. So I've never harmed anybody else, and I've never violated the criminal code. And yet here I'm being accused of a mass atrocity. That's possible because I'm so busy and the internet is so active that it's impossible to just simply police defamation of character. What am I supposed to do? Sue everybody who makes a false allegation like that against me? I couldn't even get the FBI to investigate and shut down 7 people who were stalking me at the same time in 2011. Red, I was being stalked physically by 7 people. Well, at least I was being stalked remotely by 7 people. And one of those persons moved from Sacramento to Portland, Oregon to physically stalk me. And when I contacted the FBI, all they did is put me in touch with an FBI webpage about how to file a claim with the government in the event of economic fraud online. It was complete non sequitur. They didn't say, well, sir, you have a right not to be stalked online or physically stalked by somebody using the internet to try to communicate with you, to try to find out where you live. They didn't do anything for me. So what I would do is I would have a board of internet scholars work with the Justice Department the U.S. Justice Department in determining everything that's going on online that is criminal or tortious. And then a set of standard forms would be evolved so everybody could file regarding that conduct. And then that would be a way of policing the internet so that the public is protected, but also individuals are protected.
I mean,
because there's defamation, copyright infringement, stalking.
That would definitely be a pretty heavy bureaucratic load, huh?
It would, but because the internet is now the commonplace. I'll use the Greek term agora. It's the marketplace where people go and gab. It's the most common arena of social intercourse and discourse, of communication and contact.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be made consistent with the notion of a good society, and it isn't. It's a cesspool of defamation, stalking, criminal activity, in terms of marketing things illegally, false light publicity, copyright infringement. I mean, look at a website like Scrib.